One of the greatest misunderstandings empaths have about their own lives is the belief that suffering automatically means failure. When something falls apart, a relationship, a friendship, a family bond, a career path, or even a long-held dream, the immediate conclusion is often, "I've lost something important." But what if the event you're calling a loss is actually a transition? What if the thing that appears to be breaking down is not your life, but an outdated version of yourself that can no longer carry you into the future? Most empaths spend years building their identity around being needed. They become the listener, the fixer, the peacemaker, the person who understands everyone else's pain. They develop an extraordinary ability to read emotional states, anticipate needs, and offer support. While these qualities can be beautiful, they often come with an invisible cost. Over time, the empath becomes so focused on managing the emotional world of others that they stop paying attention to their own. This creates a dangerous psychological imbalance. The empath begins measuring their worth by what they provide, rather than who they are. Their value becomes tied to sacrifice. Their identity becomes connected to helping. Their self-esteem becomes dependent on being useful. At first, this feels noble. It feels meaningful. But eventually, reality intervenes. Eventually, there comes a moment when all that effort doesn't produce the outcome they expected. The relationship still ends. The person they supported still leaves. The people they protected still misunderstand them. The appreciation they hoped for never arrives. And suddenly, the empath finds themselves standing in the middle of an emotional collapse, wondering how everything went so wrong. But this is where something remarkable begins to happen. Psychologically speaking, every meaningful transformation starts with disillusionment. Before a person can grow, they must first see reality more clearly. The problem is that clarity rarely feels good in the beginning. It often feels like disappointment. The empath starts noticing patterns they previously ignored. They realize how much energy their first increates invested in people who never invested the same energy back. They begin recognizing how often they abandoned their own needs to maintain connections. They see that many of their choices were driven not by self-respect, but by a fear of losing people. And this realization hurts. It hurts because it challenges the story they've been telling themselves for years. Yet pain has a purpose. Pain is information. It points directly toward the areas of life that require attention, growth, and change. The breakdown becomes valuable because it forces the empath to confront questions they may have avoided for decades. Who am I when I'm not rescuing someone? Who am I when nobody needs me? Who am I when I stop earning love through sacrifice? These questions are uncomfortable because they strike at the core of identity. But they are also the questions that open the door to genuine freedom. Philosophers have long understood that transformation requires the death of an old self. Not physical death, but psychological death. The collapse of assumptions, the release of roles, the abandonment of identities that once felt necessary but have become limiting. This is why the comeback always begins in a season that feels confusing. The empath interprets it as losing control, but what is actually happening is far more significant. They are being invited to build a new foundation, one that isn't based on approval, validation, or emotional dependency. For perhaps the first time in their life, they begin directing the same compassion inward that they have spent years giving away. They start listening to themselves. They start honoring their own boundaries. They start recognizing that self-respect is not selfishness. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changes. The person who once feared being alone begins discovering peace in solitude. The person who once chased understanding begins understanding themselves. The person who once gave away all their energy begins protecting it. This is not a breakdown. It is a reconstruction. The old version of the empath was built around survival. The new version is being built around truth. And that's why the darkest chapter of an empath's life often becomes the most important one. Because the moment everything familiar falls apart is often the moment they finally become who they were meant to be. Remember this. When life starts dismantling the identity you've outgrown, don't mistake the process for destruction. Sometimes the greatest comeback begins with the courage to let the old version of yourself fall away. Once the empath begins to understand that the breakdown was actually a process of reinvention, another shift starts to take place. One that is even more powerful. It is the moment they stop chasing. Now, when I say chasing, I'm not talking only about pursuing a relationship. Chasing takes many forms. It can be chasing approval from people who never seem satisfied. It can be chasing validation from those who rarely acknowledge your efforts. It can be chasing closure from someone who has no intention of giving it. It can even be chasing an old version of yourself that no longer exists. The empath often doesn't realize how much of their life has been organized around pursuit. Because they are naturally attuned to emotions, they develop a tendency to focus outward. They become experts at noticing what other people need, what other people feel, and what other people are missing. The problem is that this outward focus can slowly become an unconscious search for worth. Many empaths don't ask themselves, "Am I enough?" directly. Instead, they ask it indirectly, through their behavior. If I help enough, will I be valued? If I love hard enough, will I be chosen? If I sacrifice enough, will I become important? If I prove myself one more time, will they finally understand my worth? These questions often operate beneath awareness, but they shape countless decisions. They create a pattern where the empath continually invests emotional energy into situations that offer very little return. What's fascinating from a psychological perspective is that chasing creates the very condition the empath is trying to escape. The more desperately a person seeks validation, the more power they unconsciously give away. Their emotional state becomes dependent on external responses. Their confidence rises and falls based on how someone else behaves. Think about that for a moment. If another person's attention determines your sense of value, then they effectively control your emotional environment. Most people never recognize this dynamic. They assume they're pursuing connection, when in reality, they're surrendering autonomy. The comeback begins when the empath finally sees this clearly. Not intellectually, not as an interesting concept. They feel it. They reach a point where exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore. They become tired of explaining themselves, tired of overextending themselves, tired of carrying relationships that require constant effort just to survive. And something inside them changes. Instead of asking, "How do I make this person stay?" they begin asking, "Why am I working so hard to keep someone who isn't meeting me halfway?" That question is transformational, because it redirects attention to the only thing can truly control themselves. For years, their focus may have been on changing circumstances, changing people, or changing outcomes. But now they begin changing their standards. This is where real power returns. Power is not forcing people to understand you. Power is not convincing someone to appreciate you. Power is not winning someone's approval. Power is maintaining your self-respect, regardless of what others choose. When empaths reclaim this understanding, something remarkable happens. Their energy starts flowing back toward them, instead of constantly flowing outward. The emotional resources they once spent managing everyone else's perceptions become available for their own growth. They begin investing in their health, their purpose, their goals, their peace of mind. They stop treating themselves as a backup plan. And here's the irony that many people miss. The moment an empath stops chasing validation is often the moment they become more attractive, more confident, and more influential than they have ever been. Why? Because people are naturally drawn to those who possess internal stability. There is something compelling about a person who no longer needs external approval to feel complete. Their presence changes. Their decisions become clearer. Their boundaries become stronger. Their self-worth becomes visible. This doesn't mean they become cold or detached. Quite the opposite. They still care deeply. They still love deeply. But their love is no longer rooted in fear. They no longer give because they're trying to earn significance. They give because significance already exists within them. That distinction changes everything. The empath's greatest comeback doesn't begin when someone finally recognizes their value. It begins when they stop asking others to define it. The day you stop chasing what should freely meet you is the day your power starts returning home. Once the empath stops chasing validation, and begins reclaiming their energy, they often enter a phase that feels unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and sometimes even frightening. It is a season marked by silence, solitude, and detachment. For many people, this period appears empty from the outside. There are fewer distractions, fewer emotional dramas, fewer attempts to fix other people's problems. But internally, some of the most important psychological work of their life is taking place. Most empaths have spent years surrounded by emotional noise, not necessarily physical noise, but psychological noise. They have been tuned into the needs, moods, expectations, disappointments, and desires of other people for so long that they rarely experience complete emotional stillness. Their attention has been occupied by relationships, responsibilities, and the constant effort of maintaining connection. When all of that begins to quiet down, something unexpected happens. They come face to face with themselves. And this is where many people become uncomfortable. Because silence has a way of revealing things that distraction keeps hidden. When there is no one to rescue, no conflict to manage, no relationship to obsess over, and no external crisis demanding attention, the empath is left alone with their own thoughts, their own fears, their own unresolved wounds. At first, this can feel overwhelming. Many people assume loneliness comes from being disconnected from others, but often, loneliness comes from being disconnected from yourself. You can spend years surrounded by people and still feel profoundly isolated because you have never developed a genuine relationship with your own mind. This is why solitude becomes such a powerful teacher. Solitude removes the escape routes. It forces the empath to examine patterns that may have been operating beneath awareness for years. Why did they tolerate certain behaviors? Why did they ignore red flags? Why did they consistently prioritize other people's comfort over their own well-being? Why did they fear letting go of relationships that were clearly unhealthy? These questions don't always produce immediate answers. In fact, some answers emerge slowly, over time. But the willingness to ask them is what initiates transformation. Psychologically, growth requires self-observation. And self-observation becomes much easier when external stimulation decreases. The constant stream of emotional input that once occupied the empath's attention begins to fade, creating space for insight. This is one reason so many breakthroughs occur during periods people initially describe as lonely. What they are actually experiencing is separation from old patterns. And separation can feel strange, because the human mind often confuses familiarity with safety. Even unhealthy dynamics can feel comfortable simply because they are familiar. Even emotional chaos can become addictive when it has been present long enough. So when the empath starts detaching from these patterns, the absence of chaos may initially feel like something is missing. But what is missing is not happiness. What is missing is conditioning. The nervous system is adjusting to a new reality. A reality where peace no longer feels boring. A reality where boundaries no longer feel selfish. A reality where self-respect no longer requires permission. This is where emotional maturity begins to develop at a deeper level. The empath starts learning that not every feeling requires action. Not every impulse requires a response. Not every disappointment requires a confrontation. They discover the ability to observe emotions without immediately becoming controlled by entagin. That skill changes everything, because the person who can sit with discomfort without reacting impulsively becomes incredibly difficult to manipulate. The person who can tolerate temporary loneliness becomes less vulnerable to unhealthy attachments. The person who learns to trust their own judgment becomes less dependent on external reassurance. This is why silence is so valuable. Silence sharpens perception. Silence strengthens self-awareness. Silence reveals truth. And truth, while sometimes uncomfortable, is always liberating. Over time, the empath begins to notice a profound shift. They no longer fear being alone because they have discovered that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. One is an absence of people. The other is an absence of connection. And for the first time, they are building a genuine connection with themselves. That connection becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Because once you trust your own mind, honor your own boundaries, and find peace in your own company, You stop looking to the outside world to provide what you have already cultivated within. And that is the hidden gift of silence. It teaches you that the strongest relationship you will ever build is the one you have with yourself. The moment you stop fearing your own company is the moment you become truly free. After the silence has done its work, after the empath has spent enough time examining old patterns, reclaiming their energy, and rebuilding their relationship with themselves, a final transformation begins to emerge. This is the stage most people never expect, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There is no grand announcement, no sudden breakthrough moment that everyone can see. The change is subtle at first, but psychologically, it is enormous. The empath becomes someone who no longer needs what once controlled them. Think about that for a moment. Every human being has emotional pressure points. We all have certain fears, desires, and insecurities that influence our decisions. For many empaths, those pressure points have historically been tied to acceptance, connection, understanding, and validation. They feared being rejected. They feared being misunderstood. They feared losing important relationships. And because they feared these outcomes, they often organized their lives around preventing them. Without realizing it, they gave those fears authority. The problem with any fear is that once it gains authority over your behavior, it starts making decisions for you. A person who fears rejection may remain silent when they should speak. A person who fears abandonment may tolerate treatment they should walk away from. A person who fears disapproval may spend years living according to someone else's expectations. In every case, the fear becomes the hidden architect of their life. But something changes when the empath completes the journey we've been talking about. They've already survived the breakdown. They've already stopped chasing. They've already faced solitude and discovered that they can stand on their own. And because of that, many of the fears that once controlled them begin losing their influence. Not because those fears disappear completely, but because they are no longer running the show. This is one of the most powerful psychological shifts a person can experience. The empath starts making decisions from principles rather than fear. They begin choosing relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional hunger. They begin setting boundaries without feeling guilty. They begin expressing their truth without obsessing over how it will be received. And perhaps most importantly, they stop negotiating against themselves. For years, many empaths have carried an internal belief that being kind requires endless accommodation. They confuse compassion with self-sacrifice. They confuse understanding others with tolerating anything. But maturity teaches a different lesson. True compassion includes yourself. True empathy includes yourself. True love includes yourself. Without that balance, empathy becomes self-erasure. The evolved empath finally understands this distinction. They no longer abandon themselves in order to maintain harmony. They no longer shrink themselves to make other people comfortable. They no longer chase opportunities, relationships, or environments that require them to prove their worth. Instead, they show up authentically and allow reality to reveal what belongs in their life. There is tremendous power in that approach, because when you stop forcing outcomes, you gain clarity. When you stop managing everyone's perception of you, you gain freedom. When you stop needing external validation, you gain stability. And stability is one of the most attractive qualities a human being can possess. Not attraction in the superficial sense, but in the deeper psychological sense. People trust stability. People respect stability. People are influenced by stability. The empath who once felt overlooked often discovers that they are now commanding more respect than ever before. Not because they are demanding it, but because they are embodying it. Their energy changes. Their posture changes. Their decisions change. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when a person no longer feels compelled to convince others of their value. And this is where the comeback reaches its highest point. The goal was never to become harder. The goal was never to become colder. The goal was never to stop caring. The goal was to care without self-destruction. To love without losing yourself. To give without emptying yourself. To connect without abandoning your own identity. That is what emotional mastery looks like. It is not the absence of emotion. It is the ability to experience emotion without becoming controlled by it. At this stage, The empath finally recognizes something that had been hidden in plain sight the entire time. The strength they spent years searching for in other people was quietly developing within them. Through every challenge, every disappointment, every season of loneliness, and every difficult lesson. And that realization changes everything. Because the biggest comeback of an empath's life is not getting someone back, proving someone wrong, or finally receiving the validation they once craved. The biggest comeback happens when they become so grounded in their own worth that they no longer need anything outside themselves to confirm it. And when a person reaches that point, they don't just recover, they become unstoppable. The life you've been waiting for begins the moment you stop waiting for someone else to give you permission to live it.